estudio sobre la evolución de virus de RNA y algunas estrategias antivirales. Y bueno, después de eso ya su trayectoria se volvió un poco más ecléctica. Trabajó como postdoc en la Universidad de California en Los Ángeles, trabajando igual sobre temas de virus y cómo usar a los virus para desarrollar terapia genética. Y en 2007 entró a trabajar como editora en la revista EMBO Reports. Y ahí estuvo trabajando, para los que no sepan, la EMBO es la Asociación Europea de Biología Molecular, y entonces ahí estuvo haciendo 8 años de trabajo editorial. Después, en el 2015, entró a trabajar como editora en la sección de microbiología de Nature Microbiology. También fue senior editor. Después estuvo encargada de la sección de microbiología en Nature, y a partir de 2018 fue senior editor en Nature, otra vez. Y en 2019 le encargaron ser editora en jefe de Nature Microbiology. Entonces, Nonia, como pueden apreciar, pues ella tiene su formación científica, trabajó 10 años en laboratorios y después su carrera la inclinó hacia la parte editorial, cómo manejar todas las publicaciones en revistas de gran nivel de nuestra área. Y entonces en el currículum de Nonia me pareció muy interesante ver que Nonia, pues como parte de su labor editorial, pues le toca organizar conferencias, por ejemplo, de la American Society of Microbiology, de Nature, pero también escribe notas editoriales de diversos temas, no solo para la comunidad científica de temas científicos, sino para los científicos como comunidad. Por ejemplo, ha escrito sobre temas de diversidad, igualdad, inclusión en la ciencia. Entonces, bueno, le agradezco muchísimo que nos regale esta hora o hora y 20, si hay muchas preguntas, de su tiempo. Nonia, bienvenida, y pues te cedo la palabra.
Hola a todos, no veo a nadie, o sea que es un poco, pero bueno, supongo que estáis ahí y yo estoy encantada.
Aquí está la gente en el auditorio.
Encantada de estar con vosotros y me siento muy honrada por esta invitación. La verdad es que es la primera charla que doy en Hispanoamérica, en toda Hispanoamérica, yo creo. Y bueno, tengo muchas ganas de la discusión posterior a la charla, la verdad. Voy a hablaros un poco, o sea, lo que hablé con Marcela cuando preparaba la charla era un poco todas las novedades, ¿no?, que se vienen, que si preprints, que si revisiones por pares de los preprints, que si pre-registration, publicación de datos, publicación de protocolos. Entonces no voy a tocar mucho cómo funciona el sistema actual. Tendremos mucho tiempo después para charlar y entonces si hay preguntas sobre eso, yo encantadísima de hablar de eso, pero está centrada la charla un poco en lo que se viene, ¿no? Y bueno, la voy a dar en inglés porque casi todas las diapositivas están en inglés y entonces sería, no soy tan buena cambiando todo el rato de idioma y sería un Spanglish así muy raro. Así que voy a dar la charla en inglés, pero bueno, después, pues sí, yo cuando estoy con compadres y comadres que hablan castellano o español, pues siempre hablo español, no me siento rara no haciéndolo, ¿no? Voy primero a compartir mi pantalla, espero que funcione todo, hemos hecho una prueba, o sea que creo que funcionará y ya empezamos. Y me decís si hay algún problema, pero espero que vaya, o sea que estéis viendo todo, ¿no? Bueno, let's start because I want to have plenty of time for discussion. I'm going to put myself a timer so that I don't overspeak, which I have a tendency to do. So a very brief bit about me, especially thank you so much for the introduction. So all of this has already been said. Maybe just here you have ways to contact me. in Twitter and in Mastodon, given that we're all off Twitter now, migrating from Twitter. But essentially, I have, I'm a scientist. I'm still a scientist. I consider myself a scientist, although not an active researcher. I have a training in virology, and I've held different editorial roles. I'm happy to talk about why the transition to PLOS from Nature, which I get asked about a lot. But essentially, right now I'm at PLOS, and as you may know, it stands for Public Library of Science. It is a not-for-profit publisher and advocacy organization, and our mission is to accelerate progress in science and medicine by transforming research communication. And PLOS was started in California in the year 2000 when Harold Barmas, Patrick Brown, and Mike Eisen wanted to convince existing journals, actually, that it would be beneficial for society if findings were published and were open to read for everybody. Because clearly it transpired that existing publishers were not about to change their models without other incentives, they decided to launch their own journals. And so PLOS Biology was the first PLOS journal, was launched in 2003. We are 20 next year and very happy to prepare our anniversary. And that's the structure of the current PLOS portfolio. PLOS Biology and PLOS Medicine are selective journals that are like the flagships of the portfolio. And then there are some community journals in different aspects of biology. And PLOS also launched what at the time was the first sound science journal in PLOS One, where work has to be technically and ethically sound and correct, but there are no editorial criteria of conceptual advance for publication. One thing that surprises a lot of people is that PLOS One rejects approximately 50% of submissions because they don't fulfill this criteria of ethical soundness or technical soundness. Before I get into the fun stuff, I have to put in a plug for my journal, My Love. And so I just wanted to give you a few highlights of PLOS Biology. It's very important to me that we are a selective journal, but what we mean by selective is not what most other journals mean by selective. So we are not looking for just flashy science or things that are trendy at the moment. When we read papers, we ask ourselves if the question being asked is of general interest, is of interest to the field. And if the question is important, then very important for us is that the answer, regardless of what it is, will be important as well. And this has a way of surfacing negative and even null data that's important for fields in a way that other journals would probably dismiss off the bat. The reason I get out of bed in the morning, and if I make one contribution to the whole publishing business, is that I really want to depressurize the whole process. I think that it should be much more of a conversation between authors and editors, editors and reviewers, etc. And so one step towards that is we have this scooped policy. So if you're we think it's very independent validation of research findings are very important, and they only help give solidity to the findings and help science advance faster. And so we don't consider literature published in the 6 months prior to submission when looking at the novelty of work. We very much welcome journal independent and portable peer review. I will talk a little bit about that in a while, but in essence, if you have been peer reviewed at another journal and those reports seem reasonable and that they could support continuation of the process, we often make decisions with existing reviews from other journals and also from journal independent platforms, and that's what I'll talk about. Our reviewers talk to each other before we reach a decision, and some other things that are there. And I'm sure if you've had time to read by now. And for sure, we really are champions of open data, open code, open science in general. This is my team, my fantastic team. We have 7 in-house editors, professional editors, that their full-time jobs is taking good care of our papers. They are all postdocs, are scientists by training. And then we have 260-ish strong editorial board right at the moment, and all our decisions are made in combination between professional and academic editors. So for the fun part, let's start by saying what is open science and why is open science important. And I think a lot of the transformation that we're seeing in publishing is very much driven by the open science movement. And so open science is more than open access. Open access, which is what most people think equates to open science, is free immediate access to article, but article text and article figures. So the photos and the text by which you describe your research, and the photos that are the ultimate analysis that you've done of your data. Open science also includes, however, access to that data, access to any code that was developed, to the methods, to the materials, transparent processes at every stage. So not only transparent authorship, like who contributed to what, transparent acquisition of data, but also transparent processes in the publishing side. So no confidential comments to editors from the reviewers, publishing the reviewer reports, etc. And open science has all of the implications that I am highlighting there, including, openness to a diversity of that knowledge. So open science wants to take into consideration non-English language research, for example, be open to indigenous ways of knowledge and knowledge systems, etc. Why would you care? Why do it, right? It's not necessarily incentivized, not valued as much as it should be, and I'll get there at the very end. So what's the incentive? Why should you do it? So I'm going to give you 5 reasons that help science advance, and then some other reasons that are a little bit more selfish and can help you as a researcher in your career. So the first and foremost is access, of course, availability and recognition of intermediate research outputs if you preprint before you send the paper, for example. But also it's undeniable that having scientific results out there earlier allows for faster scientific advance, because people in the field, and I make this distinction, which I think is important, and I'll get to it later as well, the people that are close to the field will be able to read a preprint and understand if they can build on it, if they can trust it, etc. And those are the people who are going to advance that field. Very importantly, it allows for reproducibility and trust in science. So transparency is necessary for trust. If people can check and repeat your work, people know what the data that you got, they can rerun your analysis or use your data to aggregate it to their analysis, there will be a lot less questions about the robustness of your work. And you will have to be more careful, so you'll also be more confident on the robustness of your work. Data sets that are open can be integrated and often become much more powerful in meta-analysis. They can be reused. Most science relies on other people's science. And so, for example, if you put out a genome sequence beyond what you yourself may be interested in, other people will find other interesting bits in that genome, or in your electron microscopy tomograms, or in your proteome data sets, etc. And then it does facilitate collaboration. There are many examples where it lowers barriers. There's no discussion about patents, IP, royalties, etc., because everything is going to be in the public domain. And it also is an internal quality control mechanism, because the way the protocols, the ways everybody in a collaboration is working is open for everybody else to see. Why do it from a more selfish point of view, if you will? Because time and time again, now it's been demonstrated that if a paper, and this is just for open access right now, if a paper is open to read, it has a much higher metric attention score, which means it's been picked up by the press, by social media, it's been talked about in blogs, it's been highlighted in magazine sections of science journals, etc., much more there's more citations and a lot more downloads. So more people read your research, more people are exposed to your research. I just wanted to put in, in the context of open access and open science, this little plug, because I thought it was extremely timely, because it was announced yesterday that PLOS and La Universidad Nacional de Mexico have signed an agreement whereby a whole bunch of PLOS journals are included, and from January 1st, people from the university will be able to publish with no author fees, which I think is nice. So PLOS is moving. PLOS, because it was the first open access journal, it created this, what has now become, like a necessary evil, which is the author processing charge, which is the price that authors pay to publish. And we really are trying to move away from that, because that creates a lot of inequality in the system, and it can be gamed, and then there are predatory journals, etc. And so we want to move to a system where author fees don't exist, and journals are maintained a different way. So there is an evolving landscape of open science, and this is going to be the grunt of what I'm going to be talking to you guys about. And so PLOS was founded in 2000. PLOS Biology was launched in 2003. BMC Biology, Biomed Central Biology, was also launched in 2003. But for a long time, very little happened, I have to say. And it seemed, there were some small number of crazy advocates, but they were banging their drum in a void, basically. And so why has this now gained a lot of momentum is because a lot of funders are putting their weight behind it and trying to force the system to become more open. I think that it's fully understandable that if you fund research from public money, so if most of the research is funded through people's taxes and through public money, it should be free to access for those people that have ultimately paid for it. And this is where, there have been increasing amounts of policies in the European Union Coalitiones, the Office for Science and Technology in the US recently, the Gates Foundation, the Howard Hughes Institute, the Wellcome Trust in Europe, and in the United States especially, there's a big push toward open access, but also in China, there's a big push toward open access. And I know there are some countries in Latin America where there is also a push, like in Brazil, but I don't know, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. I think the price of publishing open access is, of course, a barrier. And this is what we at PLOS at least are trying to address. But what has moved the needle in the whole landscape is that funders are really pushing for it. And one way to do open science and to have your result and your research be publicly available very early is preprinting. Preprinting is depositing a manuscript draft or even final version in a server where there are very few checks and balances. It depends which server. They have different approaches. medRxiv, for example, does have more checks than bioRxiv, but essentially there's very little checks. You put your paper there, it's accessible for everybody. And so I just wanted with this slide to evidence there are increasing lots and increasing amounts of preprint servers. They can be associated, some are associated with publishers such as Research Square with Springer Nature. Some are geographic, like Africa Archive, where there's a lot of manuscripts that are in non-English language. Some are discipline specific, like Psych Archive, etc. But there's a lot of places where one can now deposit preprints. Why do we think they have a disruptive potential? So this is, if you think this is the lifetime of a manuscript from inception and data collection to publication and then assessment. Here by assessment, I mean the whole community gets a chance to see the paper and build on it or criticize it or whatever. But the whole community in the old system, up to that point, which could take years, only 2 or 3 people saw the paper. And so, I'm saying bioRxiv here because we have an agreement with bioRxiv whereby you can basically click a button and the submission will appear in our desks. And likewise, we can send your paper to bioRxiv, but you can put here any preprint server. Essentially, what people are doing, so the normal author behavior is that they either deposit when they have a draft manuscript that they want feedback on, or they deposit at the journal submission stage. But nevertheless, whichever time point they deposit, it really accelerates the publication or the making public the information by months to years, depending on which journal you are actually expecting to publish your paper. And so why some things that the preprints allow you is that they have a DOI, so they can be cited, so you can have early citation and credit. You control when you make your data available. More and more people are celebrating the preprint rather than the paper. You establish priority, which in some areas is important. And I think one thing that's a really nice outcome, and I have heard more and more cases of this happening, is that you signal that you're working on something, not just for priority, but because this allows other people to know what you're working on, and then you establish collaborations earlier on, right? They know you're working on this, they need this technique, or they're interested in this area, and you start working with other people before the paper's published. So in PLOS Biology, 65% of submissions that we send out for peer review in 2021 had posted a preprint. Preprints can give you credit. So at the very beginning of preprints, people were very worried. Would they be useful for anything? But more and more, I hear from both hiring committees and you see from funders that manuscript in preparation has lost almost all its value. Or even submitted has lost its value, because there's this joke, it's submitted to Nature for the first 24 hours you wrote your CV, and then after that, it's possibly back with you. But if you have a preprint, people can actually see what you've done. And so increasing amounts of funding agencies, etc., value preprints and CDs. So preprints are fast, they're free for the author to deposit, they're free for the reader, they're citable with a DOI, they're linked to a subsequent article if you publish it. What's the deal with them? So they are not peer reviewed. And the idea was that, everybody could put this out there, and people in the community would just comment, and people would do post-publication peer review, and therefore you would be able to decide whether you can trust this preprint or not. So does this really happen? Actually, it doesn't happen to a large extent. So PLOS did a preprint commenting trial in which all papers we received for a year across all PLOS journals except PLOS One took part. And what happened was that there was this system that was very manual and very labor intensive, but whereby any comments posted on the preprints during the time of the paper was out for peer review would be given to the editor and could be taken into account for the decision. And then we wanted to see whether this was useful. And at the end of the trial, we realized most preprints have no comments. If there are comments, are normally like, a very short congratulations, this is the best thing since sliced bread. Sometimes this link is not working kind of thing, but very, very few critical assessments. And by critical, I mean conscientious, like somebody actually reading and discussing about the science in the preprint. Anecdotal feedback suggests that authors do get this, but they often get it per email. They don't get it publicly posted on the preprint server. So to address this issue that really there is no spontaneous community feedback, if you will, several things are popping up now in the ecosystem. And so one of them is journal independent preprint peer review, and Review Commons is one example, but is a good example. I think this was launched in 2020 by the people who run the EMBO Press journals. And basically what they do is there's somebody, an editor, that handles the paper, but it's not for any journal, but they organize the peer review. So they look at the paper, they see what type of expertise is required, they send it for peer review in an agnostic way. The reviewers assess the paper, but they don't assess whether it merits publication in X journal, because it's not submitted to any journal. And then with those reports, the authors can decide to submit to any of the participating journals, which you can see there. And you can go up to 3 different journals. So, you know, a lot of times people will submit to PLOS Biology or to eLife, and if it works, fantastic. And if it doesn't work, then with the same set of reports, you know, within a few days when they got the decision, they can already go to JCB or EMBO Reports or whatever. And so PLOS has received, since we started this collaboration, over 400 papers from Review Commons. A lot of them, and increasing numbers. I mean, for PLOS Biology, I would say 90% of submissions don't require additional reviewers. They require additional re-review by the same reviewers, but we don't add other people. Acceptance rate is somewhat higher than regular submissions, so I think having the review reports does tell people, allows people to better gauge where the paper would be a good fit. The time to publication is definitely substantially shortened, even if at the first journal, but even if you end up having to go to 3 journals, you know, the time it takes you as an author to do all of that is much less than if you had gone to journal 1, gotten peer reviewed, gotten rejected, gone to journal 2, gotten peer reviewed, gotten rejected, etc. Editors do need more time for an initial assessment, because of course what you get normally is the paper, peer reviews, and either a rebuttal or a revision already. And there are other models that are a little bit different. So the philosophy is the same, but here in the peer community in journals, for example, what you do is it's open peer review. So the reviewers and the authors and the editor all know who is who. It is a relatively similar scenario, with the difference that at the end of the whole process, you can decide to publish in a PCI journal, which is Diamond Open Access. So it's free and it's published in this journal. But you can also take those reports and submit to another journal. And there's a bunch of called PCI-friendly journals. We are one of them. And so you can come with those reports and this kind of certificate that the peer community in has says this paper, you know, is substantial and whatever, to the journal. Another model, which you may have heard about, which eLife just launched. So eLife in the summer of 2021 decided that it would not consider any paper that was not pre-printed. So every paper to be considered for peer review had to have a preprint associated with it. And now they've gone one step further and said, instead of being a journal, they actually are a preprint assessment and review service in essence. So everything that will go out for peer review will be published, and the author will decide when it's published, which is the big change. So the authors will receive review reports, and they will decide whether they want to do revisions, how much revision, whether they think all of it is out of scope. eLife will publish an assessment with some controlled vocabulary. So they, you know, in conceptual advance and in technical soundness, they will rate the journal at different levels. And that's what will be. And then the authors can decide to publish in eLife, and that's what will be published, or take this peer-reviewed preprint to another journal. And so this is a little bit like the direction of travel, right? There are increasing amounts of peer review platforms. I've told you about a few. There are some others. But if you, and you know, and the increase of reviewed preprints is huge. As you can see, it's a dramatic increase. But take a look at the whole number, because you will be able to compare it with the totality of the corpus in a moment. So it's early days. There are, you know, there's still few reviewed preprints. But there is a change in this direction. To encourage also that more preprints have reviews, because of course that means everybody can, in principle, if they understand the field and if they have the time to read all the reports, etc., they can better make up their minds whether the research is sound or not if they have reviews associated. You know, there is this movement toward trying to get more preprints peer reviewed. And so there's this initiative from ASAP Bio publish your reviews that I just wanted to highlight for you. One thing that people sometimes don't know is that when you are a reviewer for a manuscript, the copyright of your review report lies with you, not with the journal. So you can do with your review report what you want. And so essentially what this initiative is saying is, if the paper you're reviewing for X journal has a preprint, at the same time as giving the journal your report, publish it in the preprint server. Of course, if you publish it in the preprint server, is associated with your name, which you may or may not want to do. But the idea is that, you know, people that embrace this open movement will increase the position. And so there will be more and more reviewed preprints. And so you can imagine different type of scenarios that come out of this dynamic, right? So now you have journals, you have preprint servers, and you have peer review platforms, and the whole thing is in transformation. But you can imagine different possibilities, right? One of them is what has been called here the extended journal, where you go to a preprint server if you want to, but ultimately to a journal, and the journal publishes the paper, and then there's post-publication peer review. So the journal itself is like a peer review platform. And Faculty of 1000 Research or Welcome Open Research are, you know, a couple such journals. There's a muddled scenario, a mixed system scenario, which is what we have right now, for example, at PLOS, at Embo Press, at Rockefeller, even at eLife at the moment still, at least, which is where, you know, journals somehow coexist with preprint servers and repositories, which also coexist with peer review platforms. And if you have a reviewed preprint, the journal will take this into consideration, but it can also take independent submissions, etc., and everything coexists. This could reach equilibrium, let's say. Or another emerging scenario could be that journals tend to disappear, right? There are very many journals right now in the life sciences. And so, you could imagine a future where there are preprint servers and repositories, and there are peer review platforms, and, then there are peer-reviewed preprints, and that's it. But I think when we think about the future and we think about what we want, actually, we have to think about what journals are right now providing, which is evaluation of the research, assessment. You can agree or disagree with the assessment, but they do provide an assessment. They provide curation and they provide dissemination. They provide dissemination because they publish, and so everybody can see what has been published there. Often they also, press release it and what have you, and talk very loudly about it. But even just by the very fact of it being published, it's disseminated. But they also curate because, people see where things are published and decide to trust or not based on journal brand, basically. And so it is a proxy for something you can trust. This may be, correct or incorrect, but it's how it works at the moment, right? There is a huge corpus of literature and journals curate. So if you think about preprint servers and peer review platforms, of course, we have evaluation and we have dissemination, because if you post it in a preprint server, it's available. But we really move away from curation in this model. So there is no curation. And I think we as a community need to think about whether or not we value curation. And this is something that we want to maintain. And if so, how? I wanted to give you an idea of the uptake of preprints because, I'm talking about eLife and about a 60-something% in PLOS Biology submissions. But I think it's good to keep a kind of like a general outlook. And so right now it's thought that, this is based on Dimensions data, which is a pretty exhaustive database. But in the biological sciences, for example, at most like 20% of research is preprinted at the moment. So there's still a lot of kind of research going through the old model, if you will, the classical model of publishing. And then it's a crowded world. I really should update this, but it's a lot of data analysis to just update this one slide. But this is 2016 data, right? And you can see already that there were over 2.5 million papers per year in STM. And there were over 28,000 STM journals in existence and indexed, yeah. So it's really a crowded world. There's a lot of research published. There's a lot of journals, a lot of papers. And so, again, I think we need to all collectively think about what we think about selectivity and curation. My own, of course, my own opinion is that we do need selectivity and curation. And so that's why I work for a selective journal, which is pluses and its minuses, but I think this does help the community track what's the most significant in their field. I want to change a little bit tack to talk about something else that's up and coming, which is pre-registration. And I think I'm a very big defender of this model. I think it has huge pluses and it addresses a lot of problems in the existing system. It doesn't fit absolutely all types of research. So, like if your research that is very heavily exploratory is less well suited, but any kind of hypothesis-driven research or comparative research would be excellently well suited to this approach, which initially was started in the psychology and neuroscience fields. And so register reports, for those of you who don't know about them, is basically a type of publication where you write up your paper project, let's say, after study design. So you generate your hypothesis, you think about what you're going to do, how you're going to set up your experiments, you design the study, you write this up, and this is what you submit for evaluation to a journal. And this gets peer reviewed. There are comments are sent back. The experience we have at PLOS Biology is that there's always a round of revision. So indeed, the experimental approach is optimized before the experiments are conducted. And then you receive an in-principle acceptance, which means that the journal that gives you an in-principle acceptance basically promises to publish the ultimate results of that research, whatever they are, as long as you followed your plan or any deviations from the plan are justified. So then you collect your data, you analyze your data, you interpret your results. You can add post hoc analysis if you want coming out of your data, but they need to be very clearly labeled. And you submit what's called a stage 2 manuscript, which is then sent to the same reviewers, which all they're going to do is see whether you have kept to your plan. What you've done is what you said you were going to do. And then independently of those results, the findings are published. I like this model because it really fits the looking at the research question aspect. So if the question is important, whatever the answer, it should be important. If you're interested in this, we published an editorial earlier this year about when we published the first one. We launched this article type and then pandemic hit, so doing the experiments took much longer than was expected and so on. So we're just now publishing the first ones. But, there's some data about the fields that we're seeing them in and when revision is happening, etc. And this is an overview of the journals that accept registered reports at the minute. Close to 300, I think probably by now, well over 300 journals accept this format, including Nature Communications and PLOS Biology, also BMC journals, increasing numbers of journals that cater to all kinds of fields in the life sciences. In ecology, large-scale ecology experiments, for example, lend themselves really well to this, because if you're going to go to the field for 3 years in a row and assess the impact of whatever intervention, a nature-based solution, or you are assessing degradation of an ecosystem, whatever, knowing that you will be able to publish this in a given journal, regardless of the outcome, is reassuring. We recently had a meeting of several different publishers that publish register reports, and we were giving a talk about it, and we were asked, why are publishers interested in registered reports? So this is not just PLOS, but includes Nature, Wiley, and other journals. And so, very significantly, of course, to promote transparency and open research, but also because it does discourage selective reporting, right? You said what you were going to do and how many data points you were going to have, and you have to report all the data points. And if the story is less sexy than you anticipated it would be, so be it, but that's the reality. And so that's what will be robust and what people will be able to build on, no? It maximizes return on investment in science because inadequate study designs waste time and resources. As editors, we so often see that a paper that in principle looks good, we either need to reject it or ask the authors to go back to the drawing board because the experiments are not conclusive. So all of that is addressed early on when it can be addressed, right? So, you will never have to redo experiments because during the first round of review, they will already have suggested how to optimize for conclusiveness. And it also, we don't have data directly, but there's data in the field that supports that research and researchers from areas with historically lower conversion rates get published. Again, because if the question is interesting and they get peer review feedback on how to address it, regardless of outcome, it will be published. And so generally speaking, we publishers would like to encourage and promote registered reports from broader fields beyond psychology and cognitive neuroscience. It's very well fit to comparative analysis and hypothesis-driven research. And also it's good author service because there's a guaranteed acceptance. So early career researchers particularly are feeding back that they really appreciate this because they know that at the end of their project, they'll have a publication. And one last thing I want to say about registered reports funding, registered reports is the fact that funding partnerships do exist. And this, here your research really has to fit certain criteria because it depends on what the partnership has been built around, but it is an increasingly useful tool. And this is where registered reports are coupled to grant proposals. And in a way that, for example, we have a pilot with Cancer Research UK with 13 different journals from, I think, 4 different publishers. And basically, there's 2 different committees at Cancer Research UK that have an open call for submission of grants. And the grants that are awarded, the authors of those grants have the opportunity to turn their grants or part of their grants into registered reports for submission to a journal immediately or shortly after. This means that we can also capitalize, and because we are partnering with the funder, normally we can get the identities of the reviewers of the grant. And so the reviewers of the grant can be the reviewers of the register report, making the whole thing more efficient. And it's a natural progression where you get research funded and you have guarantee of publication regardless of outcome. Other things that can be published that are not your traditional storyline of a finding is data. This is again not super new, but has been increasingly important. There are by now more, but this slide only gives you, a few examples of data journals that only publish data descriptors, which if you publish a data descriptor there, it will not compromise publication of your, traditional manuscript because journals don't consider this pre-publication. You will analyze and describe your data and integrate it with other things to create a hypothesis in a manuscript. And that manuscript will refer to this data descriptor. But this data descriptor is a paper. And so you can get full credit for it. And it can be cited well, and it's very visible because now you can deposit data in Zenodo and in all kinds of repositories that where when these journals were launched were not so popular, but it's much less discoverable. These journals are indexed in PubMed and Google Scholar everywhere, so they are much easier to discover. And of course, the whole process of publication of the data ensures that the data is adequately curated, has the adequate metadata, it's validated, so then it's extremely useful and preserved. Another thing that can be published is protocols, and I think this is really not news, but it's something I'd like you guys to consider because, again, it's all part of open science. methods and papers are, very short, sometimes referencing another thing that references another thing that references another thing that's behind a paywall and 10 years old. And when by the time you get there, it's actually not what you wanted. And they are an essential part of the research process, right? If you want to do it again, you need to be able to know exactly what was done and what are the quirks and not. And so there are, of course, journals that publish protocols. And even, I think even more interestingly, there's integration of protocols into articles. So PLOS One has partnered with protocols.io, which I think the university also has an account with, if I'm not mistaken. And so essentially, the protocols that you have in protocols.io can be published almost as such. And I think this is useful because beyond having, an Nature protocol published, the integration means that when people want to use it, people find it through the paper, but then when they want to use it, it's right there in a protocols.io kind of interface that allows, in electronic lab notebooks and sharing between team members and whatever. So I think the future is toward more integration of data sets, of protocols, of everything. And I want to end very briefly with some thoughts on how we get to where we're going and why is there a migration, or why is there all this change. And so the future of open science, I think, depends on reward and facilitation. Right now, the incentives in science are placed in places that do not guarantee the faster scientific advance. What's rewarded by hiring committees, what's rewarded by funding agencies, are behaviors that promote the individual scientist, a paper in Nature and Cellular Science, right? But don't promote the advance of science. And, in my honest opinion, the governments that fund this science should be incentivizing the behaviors that get them more return on investment, right? What they want is science that is robust and that people can build on, etc. But to get there, we need to reward and facilitate, because it's not cheap and it's not straightforward and it's not easy to really do open science well. And right now, there's very little incentive for people to do so because it's not really valued. And so when I give other talks, I have different forms of this slide. Sometimes I put the three of them in one for individual researchers, for research institutions, and for funders. Because this was already a relatively long talk, I just put the research institutions here, but for example, what would your university do in this context if they were, advocating open science? They would need to change practices of hiring, tenure, and promotion, supporting open science and rewarding open science practices. This is beginning to happen in institutions around the world. And we, for example, at PLOS Biology, publish a lot of articles in the magazine section toward helping institutions create kind of metrics that value open science, implement rubrics that assess these type of activities to incentivize them. And fight ingrained biases, like all of this is BS and it doesn't matter, and all I want is my next Cell paper or Nature paper, and if I have to kind of tweak my data or work for 3 years to get one paper out, that's what I'm going to do. Those biases are normally very much tied to what actually gives people funding and positions, of course. And then you have to incentivize and support, right? Provide support for open science practices. As I was saying, they're not cheap and they're not easy. People need to know how to do this stuff. Nobody teaches you, how to start open science from scratch in a lab, using electronic notebooks, depositing all data sets, all this kind of thing. That the labs that do it report it being extremely useful to them, even because it creates a historical repository. That means anybody new entering the lab have an exact account of what was done, how it was done, when it was done, what was the result. That makes, adding new lab members and building on earlier work much easier and faster. But you need infrastructure and you need core facilities to support this. And of course, avoiding conflict with other institutional practices. And just my last two slides, we are, I think many aspects of our lives right at this minute in the 20s of the 21st century are in transformation. But scientific publishing definitely is in transformation because it needs to somehow pivot from a time when, you were one of 20 people doing research on your topic in the world and wrote a handwritten letter to the Royal Society in the UK. And this was then sent physically to 2 or 3 colleagues in whatever countries and came back right to the digital age. The digital age where there's a huge global community, where there's a lot of people that have very useful things to bring to the table. And there has been a reluctance. So the digital transformation in other aspects of society has happened much earlier. We are still kind of tied to the PDF and the ways of doing that are free digital. But there's a huge push to the digital age, which is what's driving a lot of this transformation. And ultimately, I think what we hopefully will get to, and definitely we should get to, is a sustainable, equitable equilibrium that really fosters scientific advance and not individual researcher careers, let's say. And my last slide is to leave you with a thought. Open science, one of the things that I think is more important, apart from helping science advance faster, is that it promotes trust in science. Transparency and accountability promote trust. And I think there's a real risk that as we scientists are viewed by societies as some people in an ivory tower doing obscure things, never explaining ourselves to anybody, and thinking we can just give advice. The Wellcome Global Monitor is published every 2 years and canvasses people in the whole world about trust in science. There were good news in 2020 because the high level of trust increased from 39% to 43%. So that was nice because in 2018, the results were relatively scary. But there is a suspicion that now in 2022, the trust is decreasing, actually. Other surveys and stuff have thrown out that after the whole pandemic situation and changes in masking policies and the big boys that anti-vaxxers have, etc., trust in science is again wavering and trending downwards. And I think it's our collective responsibility to have societal trust in science, because the benefits we can provide to society are only such if they trust us, of course, but also because most science is funded on public funds. And there's a risk that if society moves away from trust in science, there will be pressure to defund science. And, I can imagine this type of news headlines in Fox News or wherever, or in The Sun in the UK, and having actual pressure to stop funding science. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. And open it for discussion.
Sí. Muchas gracias, Nonia. Ya pedí por el canal de YouTube que si hubiera preguntas, pues que las escriban ahí en el chat, y si las hubiera, las leo aquí. No sé si aquí en el auditorio hay alguna pregunta. En lo que aparecen algunas, a mí me gustaría preguntarte un par de dudas que me quedaron. Sin duda, pues esto son como alternativas nuevas, como tú ya nos platicaste. Yo la verdad es que ni siquiera sabía que existían alguna de ellas, y me queda la duda, por ejemplo, en el tema de los reportes registrados, estos que es solo como el protocolo o la propuesta de investigación, esos entendí que son revisados por pares, es decir, los pares pueden hacer comentarios y solicitar ajustes. Esa sería una pregunta. Y la segunda pregunta relacionada con el tema es: ¿qué pasa si ya nunca se someten los resultados como tal? O sea, ¿esos reportes quedan publicados? ¿O cómo está la cosa?
Pues a la primera pregunta sí, o sea, son revisados por pares y de hecho esa es parte de lo bonito de este modelo porque sí se piden revisiones y entonces como que se ajusta, se optimiza el abordaje experimental antes de hacer los experimentos, que es lo que como editores muchas veces nos encontramos con que si hay que hacerlo al final no hay dinero, no hay tiempo, etc. Y luego a lo que tú preguntas, hay distintos modelos. La gran mayor parte de revistas que publican reportes registrados publican solamente un artículo al final de todo, pero hay algunos, como PLOS One, que publican los dos estados independientemente y luego como que los unen online, ¿no? Pero el reporte sería publicado como tal, el Stage One Accept, y entonces tú puedes hacer tu investigación y después la puedes mandar a otro lado. Bueno, tú siempre puedes mandarla a otro lado después, que eso, si se convirtiese en una práctica muy habitual, pues la revista que hubiera hecho todo el proceso inicial, digamos que hubiera invertido recursos que al final no se ven compensados porque no hay publicación, pero lo que se cree y lo que está pasando normalmente es que, claro, como tú ya tienes una garantía de publicación, pues te quedas ahí, ¿no? Pero si de repente tú descubres la pólvora y puede ser un Nature y claro, ahora tu organización pues todavía eso es lo que valora por encima de todo y tal, pues tú eres libre de luego llevarte este paper a otro sitio y que te lo evalúen como un paper normal, digamos.
Claro. Oye, y en el caso de solo publicar los datos, yo he visto, por ejemplo, el genome data, ¿no? Entonces sé a qué tipo de datos se refiere. Son tal cual las secuencias, pero ¿cómo qué otro? O sea, no sé si tú nos pudieras comentar algún ejemplo. Por ejemplo, yo trabajo con enzimas y entonces como que, o sea, las cinéticas, el dato crudo y pues ahí están para el que lo quiera consultar o utilizar, ¿no? Porque también,
claro,
si tú publicas eso, pues la gente lo puede usar de base o de inspiración o
claro.
de
Pues
varios.
suelen ser cosas muy al sistema, ¿no? Quiero decir que como system wide o más system biology, pero si tú, por ejemplo, hicieras análisis enzimáticos de todas las enzimas de tal, ¿sabes? De una levadura o de todo no sé si es mucho, pero quiero decir, un gran estudio de la familia de X tipo de enzimas a través de todos los organismos, ¿no? Evolutivamente pues esto sí podría ser. Yo uno de los que he visto ahora en Scientific Data que me ha parecido muy bueno es un mapa de land usage a escala de 10 metros a nivel global, por ejemplo. Y es solo el mapa. Que supongo yo ese mapa luego lo estarán utilizando en otra historia que la publicarán como un artículo. Pero o sea que los que son más genome oriented son así, pero por ejemplo Giga Science y en Scientific Data es datos de todo tipo, o sea, sí tiene que considerarse editorialmente que es un corpus significativo, ¿no? Que va a interesar a bastante gente, o que podría, pero pueden ser todo tipo de datos.
Ok. Oye, y ya la última, porque no sé si alguien aquí tenga preguntas, pero me pareció muy interesante lo de esto último de los protocolos .io. Seguramente, pues en muchos de nuestros laboratorios ya tenemos un sistema así, ¿no? Están los protocolos y como tú dices, se les da, por ejemplo, a los nuevos estudiantes. Y esta pregunta es en general para las otras plataformas que nos comentabas. Supongo que, o sea, algunas cobran, ¿no? Y otras no, ¿cómo es?
Sí, o sea, bueno, protocolos yo creo que si lo utilizas a nivel individual es gratuito, pero puedes tener una institutional suscripción con ellos. El paper en PLOS One, por ejemplo, cuesta algo de dinero, sí. Y de hecho yo creo que el acuerdo con UNAM no incluye PLOS One, incluye otros PLOS titles, pero no One. No sé por qué. Pero por ejemplo, Nature Protocols, lo que pasa es que ahí ya habrá una barra editorial y así como te digo que PLOS One, todo protocolo, que sea fiable y esté validado y utilizado y tal, seguro que lo quieren publicar. Nature Protocols es un poco más selectivo y a lo mejor tiene que ser un protocolo para algo para lo que no haya tantos protocolos o tal. Pero Nature Protocols, como es subscription based para el autor, yo creo es gratuito, a no ser que cobre algo por figuras de color o algo de esto, pero debe de ser gratuito. Y Star Protocols no sé cómo funciona. Star Protocols es Open Access, así que estoy casi segura de que también debe haber algún tipo de fee.
Claro, o sea, depende del caso. Para PLOS, entiendo que el acuerdo con la UNAM es que varias revistas de la familia de PLOS, incluyendo PLOS One, ¿verdad, Shirley? Lo tenemos, podemos publicar gratis durante el 2023. Entonces, es una oportunidad.
Eso no lo sabía yo. Pues si incluye PLOS One ya tienes tu respuesta a los protocolos, porque entonces para el investigador es gratuito y está súper integrado con protocolos IO. Pero sí, o sea, sé que son algunas revistas, no todas, y entonces es que el autor, como la UNAM ha pagado, digamos, basado en los niveles de publicación de años anteriores y tal, y entonces para los autores sería gratis.
Okay. Sí, y entiendo que el que se renueve este convenio pues va a depender de qué tan poblada está esta oportunidad. Sí. Entonces nos convendría para mantenerlo pues participar en él. Y aprovecho aquí para hacer un pequeño comercial. Estamos organizando un taller con Gabriel Gasque justo para cómo se puede publicar este tipo de protocolos en la plataforma. Entonces, bueno, ya les estaremos mandando la información para que se inscriban si así les parece. No sé si aquí en el auditorio hay alguna otra pregunta. A ver, ahí vamos.
Sí, buenas tardes, o no sé si buenos días por allá. Mi pregunta tiene que ver un poco con todas estas estrategias que usted menciona en busca de la transparencia de la ciencia. O sea, creo que un poco apuntan hacia eso. Y bueno, creo que no mencionó algo sobre, o sea, nada relacionado con el tema de presentación de datos, estadística. Y mi pregunta es, ¿existe, o sea, se ha pensado desde los cuerpos editoriales o se piensa pensar en algún llamado hacia los investigadores a ser un poco más, a veces me atrevo a decir que serios y estrictos en la manera de analizar y presentar los datos? Mi comentario viene porque lo poco que conozco en esto, yo creo que creo que somos conscientes de que hay una crisis de reproducibilidad actualmente en la ciencia, y yo creo que hay dos aspectos que están matando la ciencia actualmente, no sé desde cuándo. Uno es la manera en la que se analizan los datos y otra es la manera en la que se presentan. Entonces, no sé, yo sí acostumbro a leer, soy estudiante de doctorado y veo muchas formas de presentarlos, muchas maneras de analizarlos y bueno, sí soy consciente de que no es lo mismo presentar un gráfico de barras, por ejemplo, que un boxplot. Y no soy entendido en la estadística, pero sí sé que hay mucha información que se esconde detrás de la presentación de los datos, y yo creo que es algo que influye mucho en la credibilidad y en la reproducibilidad de los datos actualmente. Entonces mi pregunta es esa, si hay alguna estrategia entre todas estos horizontes que se están explorando a ese respecto. Gracias.
Muchas gracias por la pregunta, porque es muy importante. O sea, yo diría dos cosas. Una es que sí, que los editores somos muy conscientes de esto. Es un problema muy grande. El problema que hay, y depende de a qué revistas vayas, cuan más recursos tengan, serán más vigilantes de que todo tenga sentido y de que los Ns sean razonables y de que las revistas son un poco agnósticas a lo que se hace, aunque sí que tienen recomendaciones. Por ejemplo, nosotros siempre decimos, si hay menos de 10 datos, 10 puntos, entonces representa todos los puntos, no hagas una media y tal. Pero luego tiene que haber alguien que lo mire eso para cada artículo y entonces esos son muchos recursos y no todas las revistas tienen los recursos necesarios, ni todos los editores el conocimiento necesario. Entonces es un problema, yo creo que todo el mundo está de acuerdo en que es un problema, existen guidelines y y yo me atrevería a decir que la gran mayor parte de revistas, si la gente leyera lo que piden, lo haría bien, pero no se pueden... O sea, no sé, el policing de esas instrucciones es donde falla mucho el sistema porque es muy caro. Pero entonces, a favor de eso, lo que es más importante, yo diría, porque tienes toda la razón, pero si los datos están ahí, si por ejemplo en PLOS todos los datos que están detrás de una figura, a no ser que sean datos de pacientes confidenciales y entonces lo que tienes que dar es tienes que decir cómo cualquier lector podría acceder a ellos, ¿no? Pero si no, los datos siempre están ahí, o en una supplementary figure, o en un repository, o en algo de esto. Y si tú tienes los datos, por eso es lo de la transparencia y robustness y reproducibility, porque cualquier lector puede bajarse los datos que a ti te han dado, y aunque tú hayas hecho un diagrama de barras, puede hacerse un box plot o un violin plot o lo que quiera, lo puede reanalizar. Y eso es casi mejor que intentar encorsetar a gente y decirle, pues no hagas statistical deviation, haz statistical error, porque nunca vamos a poder saber en qué caso, qué cosa es la adecuada, a no ser que cada artículo además fuera a un editor, a un revisor estadístico, que hay algunas revistas que también lo hacen, pero es muy difícil de implementar a nivel global eso. ¿Eso contesta tu pregunta?
Sí, dice que sí. Gracias. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿No? Bueno, pues si en este momento no tienen más preguntas, pues agradecemos a la doctora Pariente. De todos modos, seguramente estaremos en contacto y pues muchísimas gracias por el seminario y por tu tiempo, Nonia. Fue muy grato conocerte aquí, aunque sea por Zoom. Gracias.
Igualmente. Y nada, seguro que ahora que nos conocemos, pues nos veremos en otras circunstancias. Buen día a todos.
Sí. Gracias, hasta luego.
Hasta luego.